Phoenix, Arizona stretched beneath an unforgiving sun in June 2021, the asphalt shimmering with heat waves that made the city look like it was melting. In a modest duplex in the Maryvale district, Brandon Mitchell sat at his kitchen table, his phone clutched in his hand, staring at a profile picture that had consumed his thoughts for the past 4 months. The woman in the photo called herself Savannah Rose. She had long blonde hair, bright blue eyes, a smile that seemed to radiate youth and possibility. According to her profile on the dating app where they'd met, she was 19 years old, a college student studying nursing at Arizona State University, originally from a small town in Oregon, new to Phoenix and looking to meet people. Brandon was 28 years old, married for 6 years to his high school sweetheart, Jessica. They had 2 children, Emma, who was 4, and Lucas, who just turned 2. Brandon worked as an assistant manager at an auto parts store, pulling 45-hour weeks for $42,000 a year. Jessica worked part-time as a dental receptionist, her schedule arranged around childcare because they couldn't afford full-time daycare for both kids. Their life wasn't bad exactly. They had a roof over their heads, food on the table, a 13-year-old Honda Civic that ran most of the time. But it wasn't the life Brandon had imagined for himself. The duplex was small and hot, the air conditioning barely adequate even when it worked properly. Money was always tight, every month a careful calculation of which bills could be paid on time and which could be delayed. The kids were exhausting in the way young children are exhausting, demanding constant attention, turning every simple task into a complex negotiation. And Jessica had changed. Or maybe Brandon had changed. Or maybe they'd both changed in ways that made them incompatible with who they'd become. She was tired all the time, stressed about money, focused entirely on the children. The woman he'd fallen in love with at 17, who'd been spontaneous and fun and interested in him, had transformed into someone who only wanted to talk about Emma's preschool behavior or Lucas's eating habits or why the electric bill was so high. They hadn't made love in 3 months. Before that, it had been once every few weeks, perfunctory and exhausted, both of them going through motions rather than feeling genuine desire. They didn't go out anymore, didn't have date nights, didn't do anything that wasn't related to childcare or household maintenance. Brandon felt invisible in his own marriage, just another piece of furniture Jessica moved around while managing the chaos of their life. He downloaded the dating app in February, initially just to look, to remind himself that other possibilities existed, to feel like someone besides a father and a struggling assistant manager. He hadn't intended to actually talk to anyone, hadn't planned to cheat. But then Savannah Rose had matched with him, had sent the first message, and suddenly he was engaged in conversations that made him feel alive again. Savannah was everything Jessica wasn't. She was young, unencumbered by children or bills or exhaustion. She thought Brandon was interesting, wanted to hear about his day, laughed at his jokes. She sent him photos constantly, at coffee shops, at the gym, at her apartment, always looking beautiful, always seeming excited to share her life with him. They'd been talking for 4 months, messaging daily, video chatting twice a week. Savannah always had excuses for why they couldn't meet in person. Finals week, a family emergency back in Oregon, a roommate drama that required her attention. But she promised they'd meet soon, that she was as eager as Brandon to finally be together in person. The video chats should have revealed the deception, but they hadn't. The woman on the video calls matched the photos. Young, blonde, beautiful. What Brandon didn't know was that the woman he was video chatting with wasn't the person running the account. It was an elaborate catfishing operation involving 2 people. The woman he saw on video and the person actually typing the messages and building the emotional connection. By June, Brandon had convinced himself he was in love with Savannah. More than that, he'd convinced himself that leaving his marriage was the right thing to do, that staying with Jessica was unfair to both of them, that his children deserved a father who was happy rather than one who felt trapped. Jessica saw it coming before Brandon said anything. She'd noticed him on his phone constantly, smiling at messages, taking calls in another room. She'd asked him about it, and he denied anything was wrong, said it was just work stress, just needing some space. But she knew. Wives always know. On June 14th, Brandon sat Jessica down after the kids were in bed and told her he was leaving. Not for someone else, he lied. Just because he needed to figure himself out, needed time alone, needed to understand who he was outside of this marriage and this life that felt suffocating. Jessica cried. She begged him to reconsider, to try counseling, to think about their children, to remember the vows they'd made. Brandon felt terrible, genuinely terrible, seeing her pain and knowing he was causing it. But he also felt relief, the decision finally made, the future suddenly feeling open rather than predetermined. He moved out 2 days later, taking his clothes and some furniture to a studio apartment he'd rented in Tempe, 15 minutes from the duplex. The apartment was tiny, just one room with a kitchen and a bathroom, but it felt like freedom. His plan was to get settled, then invite Savannah over, finally meet in person, begin the relationship he'd been building for months. He texted Savannah immediately after moving out. "I did it. I left. I'm in my own place now. When can I see you?" Her response came quickly. "Oh my God. Really? You actually left her? Brandon, I'm so proud of you. I can come over tomorrow night if you want. Finally meet in person. I can't wait." Brandon could barely sleep that night, anticipating the next evening, imagining how it would feel to finally touch the woman he'd been talking to for 4 months, to start his new life with someone who made him feel valued and desired. The next day, June 17th, dragged by with agonizing slowness. Brandon called in sick to work, unable to focus on inventory and customer service when his mind was entirely occupied with the evening ahead. He cleaned his tiny apartment obsessively, bought wine even though he didn't usually drink wine, changed his clothes 3 times trying to find the right balance between casual and attractive. At 7 p.m., his phone chimed with a message from Savannah. "On my way. Be there in 20 minutes. So nervous and excited. Brandon's heart raced. He checked his reflection one more time, adjusted the lighting in the apartment, made sure everything was perfect. At 7:25 p.m., there was a knock on his door. Brandon took a deep breath and opened it. The woman standing in his doorway was not 19 years old. She was not the blonde girl from the photos and video chats. She was a woman in her 50s, heavy-set, with dark hair going gray, wearing jeans and a faded t-shirt, looking nervous and hopeful and nothing at all like Savannah Rose. Brandon stared at her, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing, trying to reconcile this reality with his expectations. "Brandon?" the woman said, her voice uncertain. "It's me, Savannah. I mean, my real name is Linda. Linda Hoffman. Can I come in?" Brandon's face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, dawning realization, and finally rage. "What the fuck is this?" "Please let me explain," Linda said quickly. "I know I don't look like my photos. I know I lied about my age. But everything else was real. Our conversations, our connection, everything I felt, that was all real." "You're not 19, Brandon said, his voice flat with shock. "I'm 53, Linda admitted. "But age is just a number, right? What matters is how we connect, how we feel about each other." "Get the fuck away from me," Brandon said, starting to close the door. Linda put her hand out, stopping the door. "Wait, please. You don't understand. I'm not a bad person. I'm lonely. I've been alone for so long. And you were so sweet, so kind in your messages. I knew if I showed you my real pictures you wouldn't talk to me. Men never talk to women my age on those apps. We're invisible. So I borrowed my niece's photos, used her on the video calls." "Your niece?" Brandon's anger was building, his face reddening. You catfished me using your niece? Do you understand how insane that is? She was helping me, Linda insisted. She understood how hard it is for women my age to meet people. She wanted to help her aunt find happiness. Please, Brandon, just give me a chance. Forget about the photos. Forget about the age. Think about our conversations, about everything we shared. Everything we shared was based on a lie. Brandon was shouting now, his voice echoing in the small apartment. You lied about everything. Your age, your appearance, your identity. You made me leave my wife. I left my family for you. I didn't make you do anything, Linda said, her own voice rising. You chose to leave. You were unhappy. That wasn't my fault. I left because I thought I was starting a relationship with someone real. Someone who actually existed. Not some pathetic middle-aged woman pretending to be her fucking niece. The word pathetic hit Linda like a physical blow. Her expression crumpled, hurt transforming into anger. I'm pathetic? You're a grown man who abandoned his wife and children for someone you'd never met in person. You're the pathetic one. They stood there in the doorway, two people who'd constructed fantasies that had just collided brutally with reality, both of them angry and hurt and unable to process the magnitude of the deception and self-deception that had brought them to this moment. Just leave, Brandon said finally, his voice tired. Just get out of here and never contact me again. We can still try, Linda said desperately. Just give me one chance. One real conversation. You might find that you actually like me, the real me. I said leave. Brandon shoved her, not hard but enough to make her stumble backward into the hallway. Linda caught herself against the opposite wall, tears now streaming down her face. You're making a mistake. I'm a good person. I could make you happy. You're throwing away something real because of superficial. Brandon slammed the door in her face, cutting off her words. He locked it through the deadbolt, and stood there breathing hard, his entire body shaking with anger and humiliation and horror at what he'd done to his life. Outside in the hallway, Linda stood crying, pressing her hand against the door, wanting to knock again, wanting to make him understand, but knowing it was hopeless. She gambled everything on this moment, had convinced herself that once they met, once he saw past the physical deception to the real connection they'd built, he'd give her a chance. But she'd been wrong. The fantasy had died the moment reality appeared. She finally walked away, taking the elevator down to the parking lot, getting into her 15-year-old Toyota Camry, and sitting there for a long time just crying, mourning the loss of something that had never actually existed. Inside his apartment, Brandon paced like a caged animal. The shame was overwhelming. I destroyed my marriage for this? I left my wife and children for a middle-aged catfish? How could I have been so stupid? How would I go back to Jessica now and admit what I've done? He said after hours of thought. He called Jessica's phone, not knowing what he'd say but desperately needing to talk to her. She didn't answer. He tried again. No answer. He sent a text. Jess, please call me. I made a terrible mistake. Please. No response. He tried calling his best friend, Marcus, but couldn't bring himself to explain the situation. What would he even say? How could he admit this level of stupidity? By 10 p.m., Brandon had worked himself into a state of righteous fury. Linda had ruined his life, and she needed to understand the consequences of her actions. He'd been victimized by her deception, and she couldn't just walk away without facing accountability. He searched through his phone, finding Linda's real phone number from their message history. He called it. She answered on the second ring, her voice hopeful. Brandon? Where do you live? He asked. What? Where do you live? We need to talk. You can't just destroy my life and walk away. I didn't destroy your life, Linda said quietly. You made your own choices. You lied to me. For months. You catfished me. That's fraud. That's illegal. It's not illegal, Linda said, her voice firmer now. Lying on a dating app isn't a crime. I'm sorry I hurt you. I'm sorry it turned out this way. But I didn't force you to do anything. Give me your address, Brandon demanded. We're going to have this conversation in person. Something in his tone must have frightened Linda because she suddenly said, I don't think that's a good idea. I think we should both just move on. I'm not moving on until you understand what you've done. Give me your fucking address. Linda hung up. Brandon immediately called back. She didn't answer. He called 5 more times, each call going to voicemail, his messages becoming increasingly angry and threatening. He tried a different approach, sending text messages. You owe me an explanation. You owe me a real conversation. Don't be a coward. Linda responded, Please leave me alone. I'm sorry for hurting you, but I'm scared of you right now. Please just let this go. Her admission of fear should have stopped him, should have made him recognize that he was crossing a line. Instead, it fed his rage. She was playing the victim when she was the perpetrator. She was the one who'd lied, who'd deceived, who'd manipulated. Brandon did what any moderately tech-savvy person could do. He used the information Linda had shared during their 4 months of conversation to find her. She'd mentioned working at a Walgreens in Scottsdale. She'd shown him photos of her apartment complex, a distinctive building with red trim. She talked about her favorite coffee shop, a local place called Desert Beans. It took him an hour of searching on Google Maps, cross-referencing her workplace with nearby apartment complexes that matched the building in her photos, but eventually he found it. Mesa Verde Apartments, a modest complex in Scottsdale, about 20 minutes from his studio in Tempe. He drove there at 11:30 p.m., his anger having built into something dangerous, something beyond rational thought. He parked in the visitor lot and walked through the complex looking for any sign of which unit might be Linda's. He'd seen enough of her apartment and background details during their chats to recognize it. A specific print hanging on the wall, a distinctive bookshelf, a blue couch. He walked past ground floor windows, looking in, knowing this was insane but unable to stop himself. On his third pass through the complex, he saw it. The blue couch visible through partially open blinds in Unit 142. He knocked on the door. Art. Repeatedly. Linda. Open the door. I know you're in there. Inside the apartment, Linda froze. She'd been sitting on that blue couch, still in the same clothes she'd worn to Brandon's place, crying and eating ice cream directly from the container, mourning her shattered fantasy. When she heard his voice, when she heard the pounding on her door, terror flooded through her. She didn't answer. She sat completely still, hoping he'd give up and leave. Brandon kept pounding. I can see your lights are on. I'm not leaving until we talk. You can't just ruin my life and hide. Neighbors were starting to notice. Doors opened cautiously, people peeking out to see what the commotion was about. Someone in the next building was filming on their phone. Linda called 911, her voice shaking. There's a man pounding on my door. He's threatening me. Please send someone. The dispatcher asked questions. Did you know him? Yes. Had he threatened physical violence? Not explicitly, but she was afraid. Officers were dispatched, estimated arrival time 8 minutes. Outside, Brandon was escalating. He tried the doorknob, found it locked, and in his rage shouldered the door. It didn't open, the deadbolt held, but the violence of the attempt terrified Linda further. Brandon, please, she shouted through the door. Please just leave. I called the police. They're coming. The mention of police should have stopped him. Should have made him realize he was about to destroy what was left of his life. Instead, it made him more frantic. He had 8 minutes or less to make Linda understand, to make her take responsibility, to somehow fix the unfixable situation. He found a decorative rock from the landscaping near Linda's front door, the kind of smooth river stone used in desert xeriscaping. He picked it up, heavy in his hand, and without thinking clearly about consequences, threw it through Linda's front window. Glass shattered. Linda screamed. The neighbors who'd been watching from their doorways retreated inside, calling their own 911 calls, describing a man breaking into an apartment. Brandon climbed through the broken window, cutting his hand on remaining glass shards, feeling the pain distantly like it was happening to someone else. He entered Linda's living room, where she stood pressed against the far wall, her phone in her hand, her face white with terror. "You destroyed my life," Brandon said, his voice eerily calm now that he was actually face to face with her. "You understand that? I left my wife. I left my kids. My whole family is gone because of you. Because of your choices," Linda said, her voice shaking. "I didn't make you leave them. That was your decision. Based on lies. Everything was a lie." "The feelings weren't lies," Linda insisted, still clinging to her fantasy even in this moment of terror. "I do care about you, Brandon. I do think we could have something real." "You're fucking delusional," Brandon said. He was holding the rock still, covered in his own blood from the cuts on his hand, standing in her living room like an intruder because that's what he was. "Please leave," Linda whispered. "The police are coming. You can still leave before they get here. You don't want to get arrested." "I don't care anymore," Brandon shouted. "My life is already over. My marriage is over. My relationship with my kids is probably over. What else can they take from me?" "Your freedom," Linda said. "Your future. Don't make this worse than it already is." In the distance, sirens were becoming audible. Brandon heard them, knew he had maybe 2 minutes before police arrived, knew he should run, should escape, should try to salvage something. But the rage was still there, burning through him, demanding someone pay for his pain. "This is your fault," he said, moving toward Linda, the rock still in his hand. "All of this is your fault." Linda tried to move away to get to her bedroom where she could lock herself in, but Brandon was faster. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back, and she screamed, loud and terrified and desperate. "Please, please don't hurt me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I lied." Something in her terror, in her genuine fear, should have stopped him. Should have made him realize he'd become something monstrous. But Brandon was past rationality, past empathy, past anything except rage and shame and the need to make someone else hurt the way he was hurting. The rock in his hand, sticky with his own blood, came up and then down. It connected with Linda's head, a sickening sound of stone meeting bone. She crumpled immediately, falling to the floor, blood spreading rapidly across her gray hair. Brandon stood over her, the rock still in his hand, watching blood pool on her carpet, and reality crashed over him like ice water. What had he done? What the fuck had he just done? Linda wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. The amount of blood seemed impossible, spreading too fast, too red, too final. The sirens were right outside now. Red and blue lights flashing through the broken window. Voices shouting, "Phoenix Police! Come out with your hands up!" Brandon dropped the rock. He looked at his bloody hands, at Linda's body, at the ruins of both their lives spread across her living room. He'd killed her. He'd actually killed her. Over what? Over being embarrassed? Over his own bad choices? Over a failed catfishing scheme? The police breached the apartment, guns drawn, shouting commands. Brandon put his hands up, dropped to his knees, offered no resistance. He was arrested, handcuffed, read his rights while sitting on Linda's couch, that same blue couch he'd seen in photos, now part of a crime scene. Linda Hoffman was pronounced dead at the scene. Single blow to the head from a blunt object, catastrophic skull fracture, massive brain bleed. She was 53 years old, a Walgreens pharmacy technician, divorced for 10 years, mother of 2 adult children who lived in California, lonely enough to create an elaborate catfishing scheme just to feel connected to someone. Brandon Mitchell was charged with first-degree murder. The premeditation was clear. He'd tracked Linda down, broken into her home, attacked her with a weapon. His attorneys tried to argue temporary insanity, extreme emotional disturbance, reduced capacity. None of it worked. The jury saw a man who'd made bad choices, been confronted with consequences, and chosen violence over accountability. He was convicted and sentenced to 35 years to life. He'd be eligible for parole when he was 63 years old, older than Linda had been when he killed her. Jessica filed for divorce immediately after his arrest. She was granted full custody of Emma and Lucas, who would grow up knowing their father was in prison for murder, knowing he'd abandoned them and then destroyed another person's life. She moved back to her parents' house in Tucson, trying to rebuild a life for herself and her children from the wreckage Brandon had created. Linda's children, Sarah and Michael, both in their 20s, flew to Phoenix to handle their mother's affairs. They found her apartment full of printed photos of Brandon, journals detailing her catfishing scheme, pages of planned conversations and research details meant to make her fake persona more believable. They found evidence of a desperate, lonely woman who'd convinced herself that deception was acceptable if it led to connection. Sarah found the stack of photos of herself that Linda had used to create the Savannah Rose profile. She'd known her mother was using her pictures, had even participated in the video chats, pretending to be interested in Brandon, helping her mother maintain the illusion. The guilt of having enabled this, of having helped create the circumstances that led to her mother's murder, would haunt Sarah for years.